My name is David Ingall, and I'm the vicar or pastor of a church right in the middle of London called St Sepulchre's in the city. This obviously is not my church though. It's a local wine merchant and wine bar. And I come here because of the theme of this short film. When people think of the great heroes of the Bible, David, Mary, Peter, Abraham, and the like, one name that never seems to make the list is that of Jeroboam. In fact, most people, even most Christians, have never even heard of him. And if they have heard of him, the chances are it's more likely to be because of a place like this and because of one of these than because of the Bible. The reason is that this, a particular extra-size 3-litre bottle of wine or champagne, is known as a Jeroboam, the only lasting legacy of a man who could have been great. And in some ways, that's all you really need to know about Jeroboam, that you don't know about Jeroboam. Because that one fact, or non-fact, that nobody's ever really heard of him, is the most important thing about this man. You see, it could, in fact it should, all have been so very, very different. Jeroboam was supposed to be one of the great figures, one of the giants, one of the leading men of the Bible. And this short film is all about what went wrong and how you and I can learn from that. We find Jeroboam's story in the book of 1 Kings, chapters 11 to 14, and it all starts with a bang. Jeroboam had risen to prominence as one of the key leaders of Israel during the reign of King Solomon. And one day as he was leaving Jerusalem, he was met on the road by a colourful prophet called Ahijah. And Ahijah takes off his cloak and starts to tear it into 12 pieces, representing the 12 tribes of Israel. And he then gives 10 of those pieces to Jeroboam. It's a dramatic symbol. Solomon's sin has caught up with him. And while because of his promises to David, God will not abandon Solomon totally, he tears away half the kingdom and gives it to Jeroboam. And actually, there's more. God also makes a promise to Jeroboam.
If you do whatever I command you, and walk in obedience to me, and do what is right in my eyes, as David my servant did, I will be with you. I will build you a dynasty as enduring as the one I built for David, and will give Israel to you.
So if Jeroboam follows God's ways, the promises that God makes to him are like those that he made to David. When you think about it, that is the most extraordinary promise. This building behind me used to be the Westminster Hospital. It's an important place in my life because it's where I was born, and where a couple of days later, my parents chose to give me the name David. It's not an unusual name. In fact, there are thousands, probably millions of other Davids all around the world. And all of us, to some degree or another, are ultimately named after our famous first forebear, King David. It's an association I've always loved. He's been a hero and an inspiration to me. Even though David lived and died nearly 3,000 years ago, he's left an enduring and important legacy. We know and read his story. We pray and sing his psalms. And most importantly of all, Jesus was one of his descendants. Jesus was part of his dynasty. When God himself came to earth as a man, he picked David as an ancestor. And so his story is part of all our stories, because God chose to use David as part of his plan to save the world. That's quite something. And all that could have been Jeroboam's as well. It was all bundled into what God offered him. If he followed God, God promised to build Jeroboam a dynasty as enduring as the one he built for David. I could have been called Jeroboam. Lucky escape. But I'm not, and none of that happened, and nobody's ever heard of him. So what went wrong? Well, God delivered on his side of the deal. When Solomon died, Jeroboam did indeed become the king of a new northern kingdom of Israel through a bloodless coup and rebellion. But it was at that point that things started to go wrong. Jeroboam realized that the temple in Jerusalem, which was in Judah, Rehoboam's kingdom, was still the center of the worshipping life of his people. And we're told that that worried him. He reflected.
If these people go up to offer sacrifices at the temple of the Lord in Jerusalem, they will again give their allegiance to their Lord, Rehoboam, king of Judah. They will kill me and return to him.
Jeroboam was afraid, and so he set up an alternative to the temple. He had 2 shrines built in his own kingdom, at Bethel and at Dan, and he had 2 golden calves constructed as a centerpiece for the people's worship. Bizarre as it may seem, Jeroboam probably intended them to be used to worship God. He didn't want to worship a new God, he just wanted to be in control, to do things his own way. Well, this obviously isn't one of the golden calves. They no longer exist. It's from a different place, a different time, but hopefully it gives you a flavour of the scene. Of a scene in which Jeroboam has tried to take control away from God, in which he's tried to do his own thing, to go it alone. Whatever his motives might have been, the results were disastrous. The golden calves drew the people away from worshipping God. And in many ways, that is the key moment in Jeroboam's life. It's the moment when he's forced to choose whether to trust God or not. He doesn't believe that God can deliver on what he had promised, and so he does something else. It was a catastrophic failure of faith. In recent years, though, Jeroboam's reputation has undergone something of a revival. Modern theologians are increasingly quick to jump to his defence. In an age where religion and politics were inextricably intertwined, where you worshipped was a matter of national importance. One scholar describes the pull of people travelling back to Jerusalem to worship in the temple. Politically, it was essential that Jeroboam should stop them from doing so, for to allow this would increase the risk of subversive action to undermine Jeroboam's position as king. In order to understand how this all works, it's perhaps worth trying to think about it in more modern terms. This is the British Parliament. It's the seat of power in our nation. And one of the most controversial political issues in recent years has been the relationship between Britain and Europe. In fact, in a recent referendum, we have just voted to leave the EU because people felt that too much power was being given away. Imagine how much more controversial it would be, though, if rather than giving away power to the EU, an institution we have actually been part of, we were being asked to give away power to a foreign nation. And of course, for Jeroboam, the southern kingdom of Judah wasn't just a foreign nation, it was actually a threat, his rival, the enemy. And that is where the story of Jeroboam suddenly becomes relevant for us. His decisions seem so reasonable. Surely any of us could have done the same thing. But, and it's a big but, however reasonable they might seem, Jeroboam's actions were in direct disobedience to God. And the reality was, he faced a choice. A choice, on the one hand, to trust in God. To trust in God despite what outward circumstances looked like. To trust in God that he could, that he would deliver on what he had promised. Or to decide not to. To decide to follow the ways of the world. To decide to trust his own judgment. To decide to take the easy path. Did Jeroboam have the courage to believe? And the reality is that we all face that same choice all the time, every day. Our situations may not be the same as Jeroboam's, but the choice is the same. So often we will find that the wisdom of the world cuts across the ways of God. And we face that choice. Do we have the courage to believe, to follow in God's ways. Maybe you face that choice at work. I live and work in the City of London, where I'm surrounded by countless different workplaces and offices. And that actually means that for us as a church, we have a real focus on what it looks like to live out our faith in the context of where we work. I love the City of London, and there's so much that goes on around here that's so good. But one word you won't often hear mentioned is love. And yet Jesus commanded us to make love for others a priority, to love your neighbour. Well, do we do that? Do we make loving others a priority? Do we put them first, even in the context of the workplace? Even perhaps in situations where it might seem madness for us? Or maybe it's at home. Forgiveness. It's not something that most of us find that easy, and yet Jesus was clear it should be a priority. How strong are you at forgiving your family or those that you live with? Maybe it's something big, like being willing to risk your career rather than do something that you know is wrong. Maybe it's something small, numerous little decisions that we make every day to tell the truth, to admit our mistakes, to forgive our colleagues, or just to be open with those around us about our faith. Of course, sometimes we will fail. We will slip up, we will not believe. Certainly I know that I do frequently. And thankfully, it's not about the score sheet, because in Jesus, we have forgiveness. We have a fresh start again and again and again. But it is about the direction of travel, our focus, where we want to be heading. Are our eyes fixed upon Jesus? Do we want to follow in his ways? Do we have the courage to believe in him? But what happens to Jeroboam? Well, in the short term, his plans seemed to work out. Rehoboam didn't manage to retake the kingdom, and Jeroboam remained king for the rest of his life. So this isn't a simple story of immediate consequences. Life just isn't like that, and neither usually is the Bible. In fact, things often seem to be the other way round. David's early years, for instance, were full of trials and tribulations, as he had to deal with the increasing paranoia and hatred of King Saul. Whereas by contrast, as we've just seen, Jeroboam seemed to get off to a pretty good start. So choosing to follow God's ways won't always look like the smart choice. Things may go wrong. Others may succeed by making the opposite choice. Life may be difficult. But then that probably shouldn't surprise us. After all, we follow a crucified Messiah, one who told us that in this world, you will have trouble. But in the long term, Jeroboam's actions were a disaster. Whatever his intentions were, we're told that what he did destroyed Israel's relationship with God.
Jeroboam enticed Israel away from following the Lord and caused them to commit a great sin.
And that sin would have huge consequences. We read in 1 Kings 13 and 14 that God turned against Jeroboam, and his later years were marred by personal tragedy and by a promise from God that his dynasty would wither and die, which it did shortly after his own death. The writer of Kings sadly comments,
"This was the sin of the house of Jeroboam that led to its downfall and to its destruction from the face of the earth."
Tragically though, by that stage, Jeroboam's sin had already spread and taken root throughout northern Israel, to be repeated again and again by each successive generation. It was a cycle that would ultimately lead to the downfall of the entire nation.
The Israelites persisted in all the sins of Jeroboam until the Lord removed them from his presence. The people of Israel were taken into exile in Assyria.
I've come here to the British Museum to see what the end of the story looks like. This mural behind me once adorned the walls of an Assyrian palace, and it tells the story of the fall and sack of an Israelite town. Here we see the triumphant Assyrian king, Tiglath-Pileser III, looking on in obvious satisfaction at his conquests. While over here we have a group of Israelite prisoners being driven off into exile and slavery. It's a sad ending to a story that started with so much promise. A story that should have been writ large in God's plans for the salvation of the world. The story of a second David, the story of God's promises fulfilled. And yet, who's ever heard of Jeroboam? His story is just a footnote in history. He didn't even make it into the museum. It's a sad tale of sin and disobedience. A story of what might have been. What might have been if only Jeroboam had had the courage to believe. The courage to believe that God would do what he had promised. You and I are not going to become kings of Israel. And therefore, what God promises us is very different from what he promised Jeroboam. It's not about kings and dynasties, but it is every bit as amazing as what he offered Jeroboam. It's nothing less than eternal life. What Peter describes as an inheritance that can never perish, spoil, or fade. And what do we need to do to receive that inheritance? Well, just believe. We need to have the courage to believe.